I'll wait for it to confirm where we are from a recording point of view. There we go, before we start. So quick intro, I guess, from me. So my name's Chris Gilman. I'm a Senior Change Manager at Her Majesty's Land Registry. I've been in that particular role, I think, probably for 3 and a bit years now. I've had other roles in Land Registry, a lot of them focused around change. See, what was supposed to be happening was we were also supposed to be joined by my colleague Lisa Moody, but unfortunately she has COVID, so she'll not be joining us today. So you're just stuck with me. So apologies for that in the first instance. Now, you'll have noted in the chat, I've added a link to a Mentimeter poll. The polls aren't very complicated. We've just got 2 questions I want to ask you halfway through this session. A little apology from Lisa there in the chat. So if you can follow that link before we get to those. And again, if in case you want to do that via some other means, I have a different way of you being able to, you could either do it on your phone if you'd rather do it that way while you're in there. There's that, and I can repost that poll if you can't see it, Charlotte. Oh, there we go. You've got Sophie and I both doing it. You've got lots of options there. So hopefully you can see that poll, and I'll tell you the point to which we're going to move across to those. So again, I think we've had a bit of a conversation more broadly with Sophie about what we're doing in change. And again, I think she'd asked us to come to this group to have a bit of a chat with you about the approach we've taken, why we've taken that approach, and I guess a bit of the journey we've been on from a change management point of view. So I'm going to start, I guess, with a little bit of a sort of a very brief, hopefully potted history of where we've been with Land Registry from a change management point of view. And again, pleasingly, from my point of view, this is a graph that speaks volumes on its own. So this is a pretty long period of time, I guess, for highlighting, but I guess it sort of sets out quite nicely, if you like, the beginning of that journey. So so that was definitely Land Registry's dark tea time of the soul, for want of a better description. We'd had a privatisation threat. There'd been a lot of work, really, about the way that's fine. Mentimeter stating the voting's closed to present, that's correct. So so there'd been a lot of challenge, and a real disconnect, I think, was probably reflected between our people and our leadership about the direction the organisation was going in. So as a direct response to that, Land Registry introduced a people change framework. And again, that was about trying to make sure people thought about the impacts on people when they were implementing change, drawing change leaders and change professionals' attention to the importance of that and why it made a difference, and the sorts of things they needed to think about as they approach that. So I think although the change framework drew on a lot of capability from different areas in the organisation, it wasn't used universally or very consistently across the organisation. So although we'd got this tool set, we got these tools in place, they weren't always adopted, they weren't always used the way we'd want them to. And there was still a sense, I think, a little bit that change was that I guess the people element of change was something one did towards the end of that delivery stage. So again, that we began to iterate, if you like, and improve the degree of use with that. So and probably one of the key stages probably for Land Registry was then introducing the local change managers. So this is a change manager in each of our business units who effectively helps land the changes that can affect those people in that particular session. So they're trying to absorb all the change that's coming more broadly from the business, and they're trying to help their people understand those impacts and to try and figure out how to manage those at that sort of local level. So in parallel with that, we also introduce our impact assessments. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about those later on. At that stage, I think that sort of probably was a big key step or a change in pace, if you like, in terms of the amount of effort the organisation was really putting into change management. We've gone from just, if you like, having those tools in place and that framework in place to really, I guess, putting our money where our mouth is, beginning to devote resource, time and effort really to managing change in a meaningful way. So we established a central change team, which is, I think, when I joined that sort of change function. We'd agreed a sort of outline strategy that helped set our direction and how the organisation was going to manage change. We'd in parallel with that, we were also introducing some leadership expectations, and I think they were making it clear, I guess, what we were expecting from our leaders on a whole host of levels, but including how critical they were in terms of helping us manage change and communicating that to our people. And we began to develop a change effort and impact plan, which was a view really for the whole organisation of what changes were coming our way. So maybe almost as a direct result, I guess, of that increased focus and effort, we focused on professionally training all of our change managers. So they all have that foundation and practitioner qualification in change management. We relaunched and reviewed the people change framework. Some of the tools I think were very grounded in the methodology from whence they'd come, and we tried to give them a more accessible sort of edge. We tried to explain and provide a little bit more guidance to try to encourage people other than the change professionals to use that tool suite. We started as well to up our expectations in terms of what we wanted from our leaders. So we were defining specifically their leadership roles in change against those expectation statements, making it very clear to our people what we wanted them to do and how we wanted them to support the changes that came their way, what their responsibilities were. If you like, one of the downsides probably at that stage of introducing these local change managers is there was a temptation sometimes to say, well, that's a change manager's job, and that was almost the opposite of, I guess, what we were hoping to do in terms of leading that capability. So it helps to reset that expectation. Again, in that same year, we launched a culture statement, which is about explaining what the organisation collectively wanted to achieve, what its future looked like in a way that included and meant something to our people. They were consulted in terms of that definition. And again, I think that made a big difference in terms of people feeling owned, involved and incorporated into that longer term strategy for the organisation. So again, pleasingly, I guess we were making pretty steady progress in terms of the way our people were reflecting on how well we managed change and the way we led and managed them through those changes. Again, we'll all be aware that there was a particularly big change that happened towards the end of that year and the beginning of the next one. And again, pleasingly from my point of view, I think we saw really positive engagement from our people about the way we handled that. I think having developed a little bit of maturity in terms of change management made that easier. Although I think, as I tended to remind people ad nauseum in the organisation, we need to remember that for this change, we've sort of got to make it essential for free. Everybody gets why we're doing it. So we don't have to spend the time we normally do explaining what we're doing. But still, I think Land Registry responded to its people well. Our people responded well to their changing environment from a working from home point of view, which was very, very new to the organisation. We barely started our hybrid working journey. And I think that was sort of supported absolutely by our understanding of where we were with that. In that last year, I guess, I'm setting that out, there's a few particular areas where we paid particular attention. So that new readiness assessment is one of the things I'm going to talk about today. We also mobilised, I guess, structurally big parts of the organisation to respond more rapidly to the challenges that COVID-19 brought us. And we tweaked, if you like, our approach to that sort of localised view of how we deployed model to try and set a context where that model still worked when we were effectively operating from several thousand virtual locations rather than the 14 offices we've got previously. The other thing I think critically we began to do at that stage of the game as well was permanently assign change managers to significant changes that the organisation were dealing with. And one of those I'm highlighting there was a Brilliant Teams Inspiring Leaders programme, which is about saying if this is a really big change, if there's a really big people change impact to it, what you need is a full-time change manager who makes sure you're helping to manage that. So again, more than a levelling off, a bit of a tip back in terms of those scores. If I'm honest with you, quite a bit less of a tip back than I'd originally anticipated. I think before we got those last civil service survey results, I was being rather more pessimistic about that potential knockback as our people had to respond to and handle a really difficult change. So I was both relieved and encouraged by I guess that was really more levelling off in that slightly more difficult circumstance. We were asking people to come back to the office. So that's a sort of potted history, and what I'm going to try and do alongside that, I guess, is explain what that change strategy that we tried to implement was about. And again, it was about three key things. It was about that common set of processes and tools for managing change. What are the mechanisms, what are the things that our people should use to manage the people impacts of change as we go forward? The other element was about developing that leadership capability. Really, one of the key things I think that was really clear to us was by increasing leadership capability and understanding of change management, that was the best way to have the most significant impact on our people. And again, that bigger cog, if you like, is a more difficult one to try and describe, in the sense that effectively getting those tools right, getting those processes well understood, developing that leadership management capability gives you greater organizational flex. It gives you that strategic capability, which means you don't always have to do the more heavy-handed hand-holding you might have to do if you're really dependent upon your change professionals to deliver that capability. So I'm not going to read all of these out to you, but I wanted to maybe draw out a few of them. So in the now side of that box, that's about the things we've sort of achieved already. The next are the areas I think we're focusing on now and we're hoping to tackle to increase, I guess, our progress on that basis. So again, I think that revision to the tool, that deployment model, I think is something I've spoken about already. I'm going to talk to you about Ready, Willing and Able. We definitely got to the point where those change managers were leading and deploying change in their environment. And again, they definitely were qualified and viewed as professionals in their own field. The challenge now was moving them onto the next step and moving their leadership teams onto the next step. And again, we began to establish that sort of change agent network, which was alongside those change managers, identifying individuals in teams and other roles and elsewhere in the organisation who would help to support change management, would be, if you like, the champions in their individual area for particular changes. And we'd made a commitment sort of to upskill them, really, to increase their capability. And we've done that by a few different things. So the next, I guess, from our point of view, was about trying to understand where we were with that tool set. Where did we need to make some improvements? Where did we need additional capability that would really make a big difference? And some of that was almost about picking at our progress. So although we'd made progress in some areas, identifying those places where we still weren't quite getting it right, figuring out what we could do next. And again, some of the tools I'm going to talk to you about that we're introducing just now, I'll be able to explain that. And again, by doing that, what we're hoping is we can increase consistency of use, because although we've definitely moved on and we have probably got some exemplar projects and programs now in terms of how they manage change, there's still sometimes those where we don't unsurprisingly quite get it right. We haven't necessarily prepared our people as well as we could have done for all those changes. So one of the things I guess we want to do as well really is increase our levels of assurance around that. And that's a good way of making sure that implementation is more consistent. And again, with that change plan, that overview, be able to clarify and communicate more clearly to our people what the impact of change, the impact of the changes that are coming. In an ideal world, what we want to be able to do is create that long view of those change impacts. And instead of focusing timing on delivery, really begin to plan from a long time in advance how delivery and implementation might be different. We might be ready to deliver at this stage of the game, but it might be better to wait a month to implement, or we need to increase the pace of delivery so that we can get that impact position right in the sweet spot in terms of where those things roll. So those deal with, if you like, that's the sort of tools element. There's a focus here, I guess, really on that change management role, and again about trying to get them more focused, I guess, on enhancing change capability, and as a result of that capacity, moving them out of the doing role from a change management point of view. And again, that moves on to then that sort of strategic capability. I think one of the things we'd like to do as well, and we're working on currently, is embedding that change network more effectively across the organisation, really developing that community of interest, which currently we're sort of leading from the front. So that's where we are in terms of that strategy. Those are the things we've achieved and the things I guess we're still working on. One of the things I guess we did in terms of making the case for that change strategy was we tried to set out how what we were doing aligned to the organisation's broader ambitions. And those broader ambitions were set out in terms of the organisation's cultural aspirations. So the Land Registry's culture model is based on these 7 lenses. And again, what we were able to explain, I guess, to our exec board and our leaders and the organisation more broadly is how really focusing on the areas we're talking about in terms of that change strategy help them achieve their goals. Again, it's a different way of presenting the same information I've covered already, so I'm not going to read that through for you, but it was about saying this is how we're helping you achieve these particular areas, how we think reaching, if you like, the highest level of that cultural aspiration is best achieved by managing that change properly. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the people change framework. What is it? So really, from our point of view, it's a structure. Although there are tools, although there are things we ask you to complete, it's more about the structure. It's more about having the right conversations with our people and involving the right people at the right time, giving them the time to understand a change before we implement it. There are 4 stages in that whole process, and I'm going to do these in a bit more detail, so I'll try and keep this brief. There's that make it essential, that make it ready, make it happen, and make it stick. And I think probably one of the key things to understand about the people change framework is how it's based on two pretty well established change methodologies. So the first one of those is Kubler-Ross's change curve. So I'm not going to labour the point because I think this is probably something you're familiar with. And again, it reminds people that particularly a change we do not like, we have an emotional and involuntary emotional reaction to. It doesn't matter whether we're a change professional in our day-to-day lives, we still go through that change curve. We still have the shock and the denial. We still get frustrated. We still have that dip once we accept these things are happening and we realise maybe the things we don't want to happen are going to happen anyway, and then we have to begin to work through that. And it's only as we come out to the other side that we're really ready, I guess, to engage with that change, and we're able to see perhaps the positive in those changes we'd not seen before. I'm not going to say much more about that because I'm absolutely sure it's a theory you're familiar with. So one, again, a little bit more recent, I guess, but still really well established, is Bridges' transition model. So a bit more counterintuitive, this one, in the sense that Bridges talks about us beginning with endings, which sounds a bit strange. But again, I guess the key thing for him is about that. You've got to start with losses. And again, we find that really useful when we reflect on the people change framework, that neutral zone is that period of flux where you don't know what's happening. I think the neatest way anybody's ever described this to me is that view of the trapeze artist. And so endings and the neutral zone, endings and moving into the neutral zone, is about letting go of the trapeze you're holding and getting ready to grasp the one that's coming your way. I guess sometimes the challenge in terms of the changes we're leading our people to is we're asking them to let go of the trapeze they're on when we can't really show them what the trapeze, the swing they're leaping to looks like, or in fact where it is. And again, I think Bridges does a really good job of describing that fear and that uncertainty, and it helps, I think, people to understand where they are in terms of that element. I guess the other thing that Bridges describes really clearly is it's a very personal journey, and that people are going to move through these phases at different stages, and we have to expect and accept that. So new beginnings is a point at which you begin to move on and engage positively with that change from his point of view. And those two models, if you like, drive a lot of what we ask people to do with the people change framework. So a bit more detail on the people change framework. So that first stage, as we've described, it's make it essential, and it does literally sort of do what it says on the tin. Why is this a change the organisation needs to do? What is the rationale and the case for this change? And why is it we're confident as an organisation that this is the thing we should be doing? Key things in here are identifying up front who the right people are, how it is we want to engage with them, and I guess critically understanding all of those impacts. If we go back to Bridges, one of the key things I guess he tells us is people being able to accept their losses is really critical to their moving through that change journey. So understanding all of those impacts enables us to do so, enables us to highlight to those people what that looks like. So again, there's some other elements that are sort of covered there in terms of key things we try to do. Set it in that organizational context. How does it align to the organization's strategy? And are there any key problems right at the beginning that we need to address? Are there any key issues we've not identified up to now? How are we going to manage those risks? And again, that's both at an organizational level, if you like, a project or program level, and from an individual team receiving that change, begin to manage those at both those levels. So again, we've got a range of tools there that I think that Kipling questions model will be really familiar to people. What I'm going to dig into a little bit more detail is that people change impact assessment, because I think it's probably been key in terms of our own journey. So it's not really a terrifically complicated tool. So really, it's just a way of trying to identify the types of impacts we're going to feel organisationally as a result of this change, and it has a particular focus on the people, and it looks at those from a number of lenses. It thinks about the day-to-day practice in terms of the way you're working. Are your processes going to change? What's that going to look like? It thinks about, does it mean you're going to have to adjust your resourcing, your organisational model? And again, that can be at a very high level, or that could really be down in the detail. It thinks about working environment, and again, that's more complex, I think, now in this sort of hybrid environment. So, in the old days, that might have been about access to equipment in your office. Now we might need to think about the software and the kit people are using at home as well. That focus on people's capability. Is this something they know how to do already? Is this something we need to upskill people and train people to do? How comfortable are they maybe with some of the emotional challenges associated with this particular change? That alignment to that culture model and that engagement. Do we understand how it helps the organisation meet its cultural aspirations, and have we understood the potential impacts on engagement? Introducing a difficult change an unpopular change or a change that's going to be a struggle for a lot of people always has an impact there. That isn't a reason not to do it, but understanding those impacts and having thought about how you're going to manage those up front can make a massive difference. So that leadership or management development, is this a change that your leaders have managed before? Is it something they understand and they're familiar with? Do they have the skills and the capability to help you implement that change, that health and well-being angle, which can link, I guess, or has in the past been linked quite closely to that work environment, but I think is much more thinking about actually people's emotional resilience, the pace of the change, and the complexity, if you like, of what they're having to deal with currently. And again, a later addition to this quite inward-facing tool has been a focus on customer. So we've introduced a separate customer impact assessment that deals with a very similar run. And again, begin to get our people to think about the impacts of customers and relate that mitigation both to the impacts on them and to our customers as we move through this. So the key thing to the people change impact assessment is we complete it, we come up with these impacts in collaboration with key stakeholders, and that includes our trade union colleagues. So there are some key stakeholders you always have to include, and most critically of all of that is the people who are really affected by the change. It's ever so easy at project and program level to write down a series, if you like, of management assumptions about what these sorts of things will look like and how they'll be felt. And it isn't really until you talk to the people who are involved in the day-to-day work that you understand all of those. So critical that they're involved. I guess the other thing right early on in that stage as well is it doesn't have to be a complicated document. It is really about almost trying to brainstorm all the potential impacts. What tends to happen through its life is they reduce. When you first begin to talk about a change, and you first begin to think about your implications and your implementation plan, some of those changes, some of those impacts can feel quite scary. What tends to happen as you begin to mitigate those and you think about your action planning is they become more manageable. So initially, it's just a place where we can highlight those impacts. Then we begin to identify the key impacts we need to mitigate, and then we review it throughout the people change framework, throughout that change cycle, so we can understand how things are progressing and the sorts of impacts we need to take account of. So again, we publish and share that PCIA with the affected staff, so we're transparent about our view about who affects the change. We tend not to publish it very, very early on when, if you like, you've got that long list of impacts you haven't really ratified. So that's that first stage, that make it essential stage. And again, the key thing, I guess, and going back to Kubler-Ross and Bridges, is that the key thing here for me is there must be distance here between the make it essential and the make it ready. People need the opportunity to get over that initial emotional reaction before you ask them to begin to think about how we should implement this change in their team. You can't always do that, but that should always be what we're aiming for. So the next stage is make it ready. And in the very simplest terms, this is really about where you're doing your planning. So what are the things we need to do from a change point of view? What are literally the nuts and bolts that we need to put in place to manage the people impacts and the actual implementation of this change, not necessarily just the delivery, which is very tempting to focus on. By this stage of the game, you should be clear what those benefits are that you're planning on measuring, and you should have established a baseline to figure out how you're going to do that. You should have a plan both at that sort of organizational level and a local level to set out how that's going to work. Again, one of the things we remind people is throughout the people change framework, go back and review your stakeholders. Don't just imagine that throughout the life cycle of the change they'll remain the same, because that's never ever the case. A lot of this really is about reviewing that and I guess completing what I've called here those office readiness assessments. And that's, I guess, one of the first questions I want to ask you. So assuming you've been able to follow that link, I'm going to ask you to go to that Mentimeter poll, and then I've got a question for you. So let me just open the poll, if you'll bear me a second. So if I open that for you. So within your organisation, what type of readiness assessment do you use currently? So I'll wait for those to stabilise. I tend to find when you do these things, first of all, the scores roll around all over the place. I'll give you a little bit of time. Okay, a lot of not using them, which is interesting. One for workshop. I guess where they're in place, it feels like some sort of a checklist is the most common. So we've got a couple of something else's. So the people who put something else, could you just pop in the chat what the something else is? I'm just sort of curious about how those run, and we might be able to pick those up as we go through. So I guess in terms of this particular audience, it looks as though most people here are saying they don't do some sort of assessment, and those that do have got some sort of checklist, if you like, identifying that things are in place that they need to roll through and run through. And interestingly enough, an interactive workbook, posh checklist. I love that description, Nick. That's brilliant. But again, that is interesting because again, it is that sort of checklist approach. And again, that's exactly where Land Registry started. So we had a readiness assessment. I'll need to ignore the question element. If I go back to my PowerPoint a second, bring you on to the next piece. So we'd always got a readiness assessment, and really it was at the end of each stage of the people change framework, we have a checklist of things you should be in place before you move to the next stage. And again, we began to adapt those before we implemented the change to add a few specific questions really that set out what particular elements you might need to think about in terms of this particular change. And again, it was primarily about understanding that you'd really got all of those plans in place. You'd done the things you needed to do and make it ready there. The challenge with them was they were very focused on the process. Do you have a communication plan? We didn't really have any feel for whether or not that had gone well, how well it had been implemented, how the people were reacting. Do you have some sort of implementation plan? Do you understand how you're going to make these changes practically in the office? But no real understanding of whether or not the people who were, if you like, the victims of the change, which is a not very cheery way I tend to describe those people, really had any confidence in those. Did they think they were realistic? So we've started using, and again, it's probably a little bit over a year now, we started using a tool where we tried to make that more interactive. So we tend to maybe towards the end of Make It Essential, begin to talk to people about what that change was, and then try to understand from a team point of view what that looked like. So what is that assessment? So again, the idea is it's a self-reflection from the team who are taking on that change. They identify for themselves how ready they feel for that change, how willing they are to adopt it at that point, and how able they feel. And again, that readiness is about they understand what it is, they're aware of the goals, and they're beginning, if you like, to sort of manage the implementation and thinking about the actions they need to take to make it work. That willingness is about how keen they are to make a success of it, whether they're looking for ways to make this work and they're being proactive about that approach. And that ability is, do they really know what they need to do? It can be interesting in terms of the way the scoring works when you have a change where people really like the idea of the change, but it's really, really early on, because sometimes they'll score themselves really highly across that whole run. And it's only really when you begin that conversation with the team about their ability if something doesn't work the way they want to, or their understanding about some of those areas, where you begin to rationalize some of those scores a little bit. So best done as a little bit of a workshop with that team, particularly for a bigger change, where you have a conversation with them about what it is, what they think perhaps the enablers and blockers to that change is, and then you get them to assess themselves. There are probably two key strengths to this from my point of view. So the first one is that you're actively engaging the people who are really affected in that change in a very meaningful way. They feel really involved in that change. You get a degree of buy-in that's really difficult to do when really you're only engaging with their leadership. The other element is the actions to improve those scores aren't all about just sending it back to the leaders, sending it back to the project. The team have to think themselves about the things they need to do, and that ownership of those actions has been probably one of the key advantages we've found in terms of that implementation. So to give you a bit of a feel, we've got a bit of a guide for what the scoring looks like. I'm not going to give you, I'm not going to read every single element of this, but again, in terms of where those things sit. So again, if in terms of trying to get some consistency in terms of where that scoring would be, if you're at 1 from a readiness point of view, you have no idea what this change is about. You've no idea why it is we're doing it or how it relates to our business strategy. The opposite end of that is actually, I completely get it. I completely think it's the right thing to do, and I completely see how it helps us to achieve our goals. And again, it runs in a very similar way across all 3 of those lenses. We've had really positive feedback from our people about being involved in these sessions. And again, it absolutely makes it clear from their point of view that their leaders are engaging them in the changes that are happening. The other thing I've set out on this graphic here as well is what we're calling the minimum level, and if you like, the target level of engagement before you take these forward. So again, you don't for more complicated changes, for how you identify or you get people to do things that they're not necessarily very keen on, we set those minimum levels quite low. Good question, Mike. And again, I guess our argument was, before you implement a change, You want people not actively acting against it. So if you like, 5 to my mind is sort of almost like neutrality. You need at least neutrality. And what we're suggesting from a willingness point of view is you at least need that before you can stand a reasonable chance of implementing a change. For the readiness and the ability, you need more than that. You need them to genuinely understand why they're doing it, and that then they need to sort of be ready to run. In terms of the ability element, again, you need them to understand what they're going to do if those things don't work out the way they planned. So a question there about how the number is agreed in a workshop. So it's a conversation. And again, the idea is you try to get the team to agree where they think they are. But I guess I'd say in terms of the way you facilitate that workshop, the range is as interesting to you as the facilitator and the practitioner as where those scores end up. If you've got a lot of if you've got some people on 1 and some people on 9, that's a lot of variation in that. The reason I think it's best done as a conversation is because at least as the team leader for that, then you'll have an idea who are the people who you need to offer the most support. So the idea is you'd have those initial scores, and there is a lot of variation then, and then you have a conversation with them about where they've put themselves, why that might be the case, on what basis have they come up with that score, and understand what those challenges are. It isn't usually difficult to agree a sort of a between 2 places type score with that team. We haven't particularly had a challenge with that, but I think from a leadership point of view, understanding those people who've scored either really low or really high can be really helpful for you in terms of both identifying your change champions, the people who are going to really help you implement this change, and the people you need to offer some more support to. Obviously, the most important thing with this is it's engaged and it's positive. There isn't, you're not deliberately trying to manage people's scores up. What you actually want is some honest conversations with them about how they feel about this change. In fact, occasionally we've definitely had the opposite, where we're sort of beginning to rein in their optimism about how ready they feel for this, where you're more sort of pulling them back saying, I'm not sure we are able to deal with all of this yet. There's these things we still need to get our heads around. So that's the way those work. So again, next question maybe is around when do we do it? So maximum in the workshop's interesting. We tend to try and focus those on like a pod or a team. So a pod from our point of view is about 9 or 10. We have done them with bigger groups, but obviously you up your sort of admin level in terms of the way those work. 4 to 15 members. I wouldn't be nervous about particularly running them in with 10 to 15 people. I think that would work perfectly well personally. I would tend to do a separate session for each team that are affected. Now what you can do though is you can make those teams different, or those sessions different in terms of their tenor. So if I'm a team that's only lightly affected, this might be a bit of a conversation at a stand-up at the beginning of the day, where I explain what I think the change is. I think I explain as their team leader how it is I think they're going to be affected, and then I get them to set out where they think they are at this stage of the game. Now, depending on those scores, I might want to do a more involved session the next time around. Now, where you know it's a team that are really seriously affected, I think you do need to engage that whole team. You need to run a separate session with them. And again, where we've had bigger changes that affect everybody, that's definitely the approach we've taken in Land Registry. For most of these, you focus most of the effort just on the couple of teams in the particular business unit that are affected, and it tends to run that way. So I'll skip on to when. So when. So once you've, and again, the when evening make it essential can vary quite a bit. So for that light touch change, that change that you think there isn't too much of a challenge, you can do that initial session not very long after telling them what the change is and explaining why we're doing it. Where you know there's a bigger impact, you want people to get over that initial emotional reaction before you start talking to them about readiness. So you might leave that later and make it essential. So the idea is you do that first one at least before you leave that make it essential stage of the people change framework. From readiness point of view, at the very least, you need to do that early enough before implementation that you've got time to resolve any problems. So towards the end of Make It Ready, you do another assessment. And what you're hoping to discover is people have picked up those actions, taken them away, resolved some of the key problems, and people are generally feeling more confident across the piece. So I have had to stop at least one of those second readiness assessment workshops where it was really clear people hadn't continued their actions, so we weren't able to progress. But again, I think some of the challenges our leaders have found about doing these sessions is it is supposed to be a bit of an open and an honest appraisal of where we are and where we're getting on to next. And that's sort of where you get the value from them. So that's where we've tended to run them. And again, in an ideal world, they're led by the team leader. We've definitely, in the early iterations, had lots of support from the change managers and the change network in terms of helping to facilitate those. But increasingly, I think our people are building confidence in terms of particularly running this session. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, and I think I've covered most of the questions we've had as we've been going. If there's any questions it turns out we haven't covered during the session, we will try and pick those up and answer them separately afterwards. So rather bizarrely, I almost describe the next stage of the people change framework is in some respects the most straightforward. This is really about where you put all of those implementation plans into practice. The key thing here probably to do, and the most challenging thing to do from a people change point of view, is keeping track of how it's actually going, making sure you're not rolling with those plans regardless of what happens, you're responding to them, you're convincing your people that you're where issues are identified, you're beginning to resolve those. So most of this is about ensuring you're continuing that communication. You're giving people the opportunity to feedback and you're able to resolve those issues as they arise. Sometimes when things go really wrong with a change or you don't get something you've actually been able to anticipate, you do have to stop or pause at this stage of the game. But if you've involved the right people in the early stages in terms of those impact assessments, if you've involved the right people in that make it ready stage, we don't see that very often. In some respects, I probably don't have massive amounts beyond thinking about getting people to reflect honestly about how they feel the change is going and responding to that to say about make it happen. I guess one of the arguments we make in the organisation as well is if you put more effort into make it essential and make it ready, then this element becomes easier because you're less likely to be surprised by what happens during implementation. So the final stage then of the people change framework in our world is make it stick. And this is about embedding the change, evaluating the outcomes, and thinking about what we've learned as a result of this, whether or not further changes are necessary. So again, being utterly honest, this is probably one of the stages of the people change framework we've struggled to implement most successfully. This is one of the stages where the delivery vehicle, the project might have closed at some point during this stage of the change. And again, and as a result of that, some of the organisational structure isn't there necessarily to support it. So that sustained activity is really key here. So again, we do have, and we have had a version of an implementation assurance model that we've tried to set out. But again, before we get to that, I'd like to take you back to the survey and get you to think about the next question. Let me move this along, which is what kind of implementation assurance do you use in your organisation? So assuming you do one, how does that work? I'll let you answer that. Oh, sorry, I'll flip back to survey. Okay, so again, it feels as though most of you are saying that isn't something you do yet, which again is fine and sort of makes sense in terms of that assurance element. But those of you who do, I guess, have identified a checklist. We've got a couple of people doing more like a workshop type of element, and again, something else. So again, if whoever's put something else could let us know what the something else is, I'd be really interested in what that other thing is, and it might be interesting when we move on to the next bit. Okay, thank you for that. That's really helpful. So again, in a very similar way, that's sort of where Land Registry started. We tended to do either a checklist to figure out, we'd send out to the teams who were impacted by a change to try and ensure that the process hadn't changed, people weren't doing things they weren't supposed to, or we'd use things like lessons learned workshops or post-implementation reviews to try to understand how the change had gone and if there was anything we needed to learn from that. There were other assurance gateways that we were using internally and externally, which I think helped us understand some of that, but there were problems with them. And again, they were very similar, I guess, to some of that, the readiness challenges. So they tended to be completed by the leaders, either the team leaders or the people who've been accountable and responsible for delivery of that change. So they'd got a very particular perspective about how it had gone, what it had done, and they'd sometimes got a vested interest in saying it was all going really well. It was really difficult for us to understand, okay, beyond at that very highest level or whatever level that lessons learned exercise was run, how the impact had been felt differently in different parts of the organisation. Did we feel that a particular business unit, a particular team or a pod had worked particularly well or particularly badly, and could we really drill into that? It was really hard for us to understand that. And again, most problematically of all is beyond a little bit of representation. It didn't meaningfully engage the people who were actually implementing the change. What we definitely found organisationally was, particularly where they're process related and there's fluctuation or variation in terms of what people do, it's very quickly when you move your focus from what they're doing on a day-to-day basis to the next thing you're involved in, different these things begin to, maybe people re-establish, like I said, some of the habits they'd had before. That process begins to change. People begin to adapt to without thinking about what the wider applications are. Again, so just looking at your point there about the gateway process for change and post-change, we definitely do those too, and those sort of lessons learned reviews. Okay, that's a similar model, I guess, to where we were. So again, in a very similar way, what we've begun to move to, and this is only just began to move to, is a very similar model to that readiness assessment. It's just got slightly different headings. So we talk about the implementation. How well did we do that? How well have we implemented that change? Have people understood what it's doing? And is it clear now that that it's going the way we expected? Critically, what do we need to learn from an implementation point of view, both about this particular change and the way we manage changes going forward? A particular focus here on benefits. Are people beginning to see the benefits we'd expected and anticipated from the change? Were they clear about what those benefits were in the first place? And are we seeing any additional benefits or disbenefits that we hadn't anticipated when we implemented that change? And again, definitely getting that from the horse's mouth. And embedded is about that stability. How likely is this change to stick exactly as it is? And I guess that stability is key for me in two respects. First of all, have people understood it well enough that it's going to roll and it feels as though it's operating for people? And if people are beginning to tweak it already, does that suggest there's an issue with what you've tried to implement? Excuse me. So I'm going to cover this really briefly. In a very similar way, we'd sort of set out similar scoring criteria. Again, a sort of a minimum and an ideal doesn't feel as material here because we're not making a go no go decision. We've already, this is post implementation. But again, to what extent do they feel like we've done a good job? So if I take that implementation element, did we really manage to change from their point of view, or did it feel virtually invisible from a change management point of view? The very opposite to that, even with a change they don't like, is that they felt supported and understood in terms of the change that was happening. So again, similar type of approach in terms of where those things were rated. And again, a very similar type of session. Again, I think reflecting on some of the conversations we've had during the readiness assessment approach, the degree of involvement in this is probably about, or how active you make their involvement. This is probably about the scale of the change for that particular team. Again, the idea is each affected team at least does some sort of version of this. And again, you look at them doing it in two key phases. So the first time around, I guess, would be relatively early on in that make it stick stage to understand your early indications of how well this is going. And again, depending on those scores depends on when you do that second time around. So if it's clear, things are going really well, you're beginning to see that early benefits realization, it feels like that process is really stable, people understand who they need to talk to if they want to change it, you can do that second session pretty quickly. If it's clear there are challenges and you're not expecting those benefits to be realized for quite a while, then that second session needs to be a lot further in the future, really. The important thing again here is that you pick up the actions to resolve the problems you identify. There's both the actions within the team and the actions at project and program level. Again, really early days with that assessment. And again, we've ended up trialing, if you like, a full rollout of this initially on a change that didn't go brilliantly, actually, in some key elements. Some of the key deliverables didn't work the way they wanted to. So again, they've been quite involved and lively sessions, as I'm sure you can imagine. I guess the one thing people have said, even though the change didn't go brilliantly, was the opportunity to actually set out what went wrong, what needs to be put right, has made a massive difference to the people who are involved. Again, I think it's best done by the team leader or the line manager with that support. Again, a little bit like we talked about with the Ready, Willing, Enable assessments, we're doing a bit more hand-holding from the sort of change practitioner while we do these, just in terms of making sure I guess the right type of approach to the conversation happens. And again, just to help give those line managers some support and some confidence. I think there's only one project we've done that second stage element on, but again, the key thing here as well is making sure you've got somebody involved in those, or means to escalate any project or program level changes that need to happen, iterations that need to happen, back up to the delivery vehicles on that basis. So I guess that's a bit of it. Those are two tools, if you like, we've spent quite a bit of time playing around with. And again, hopefully they give you a bit of a feel for the way we use the people change framework. Just a couple more slides from me, and then I'll open it up to any other questions, although we've had some really good ones while we've been going. So again, this is a visual I've used quite a bit to try and explain why we think this is a good idea. And I'll remind you, I'll kind of ask you to cast your mind back to the change curve that I guess we've set out here in that blue line in terms of where people are emotionally, and if you like, bridges transition theory across the bottom. Now, if you don't put very much effort in up front, so if these coloured areas are the stage of the people change framework, if you don't put too much effort into making it essential, you don't put too much effort into make it ready, from a change curve point of view, you've sort of got people entering make it happen when they're just leaving their shock and denial phase, and they're entering the dip that's accompanied with the anger that comes with some of that. So again, probably not in the right frame of mind to be really implementing that change. The other point we sort of make in terms of effort here is you're going to put a lot more effort into make it stick. Make it happen is going to be harder work as a result of that. Equally, from a transition point of view, you probably haven't really got people leaving endings, accepting their losses until really late on in terms of that make it happen. So you're not setting yourself up very well for really those people involved and affected by this change engaging in what it is they're doing and what it is they're trying to take them forward. So that's the sort of the world we're aiming to avoid, if you like. And I guess what I'm saying, by trying to use a structured framework and thinking about the timing, again, maybe a different type of effort, maybe not less effort overall, but by putting more effort into that make it essential and make it ready, your people are more likely to be in a more positive frame of mind by the time you're trying to ask them to plan the implementation and you're asking them to make it happen. I guess the key thing always to tell people, and we tend to say this a lot to our leaders and our line managers, is just because you manage the change well doesn't mean there isn't that emotional reaction. What you hope to do is reduce the depth of that dip, the height of that anger, and I guess the length of time it takes. That's sort of what you're aiming to do. So that's me done. Thank you for your polling questions. We've had some questions while we've been going. I think I've covered. Any other questions or anything that people want to ask at the end? Do let me know if there isn't a question I've answered, Sarah, or there's something I've missed, won't you? I'll give you a minute to have a think. You're welcome, Jemima. I'm glad it was useful. I think some people have replied already. We will definitely be sharing the pack. I think we can publish them in the files on this particular call. And again, I think I can have a chat with Sophie about the best way to share it more broadly. So it's a good question there. Is there a difference between the change manager and the change agent? In Land Registry, there absolutely is. So the change manager is somebody whose full-time job is about managing change. Those change agents are, and again, even that local element, the change agents are people within teams who are doing this alongside their day job. So what we've done in Land Registry is we've given the local change manager some obligation to develop and support those. And again, that's sort of been our approach. What we're also doing then nationally is we've established a change community of interest, and we're doing a sort of at least a monthly sort of learn and engagement session with them. Maybe a theory, maybe a walkthrough a tool, maybe an example of a sort of change as these sort of run. Cool. Interested to know about the integration between change management and project management. Again, I think the key thing we're slowly working on really here is trying to making sure that change management is, if you like, hardwired into those project delivery plans right from the very beginning. Like many organizations, our delivery folk are quite rightly focused on that almost first and foremostly. And what we're beginning to do really, I guess, is get them to think about the change management up front. We've done that two key ways in my mind. We've written the change management process, the people change management process, into the process they follow more broadly at an assurance level. And we're contracting change managers to those projects right at the very beginning. I was at the point probably a couple of years ago where we were persuading them to include a change manager in the early stages. I'm now struggling to meet their demands. So again, we're making progress, not necessarily there. Simon, I noticed you got your hand up. Simon also works for Land Registry.
Hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry, I got a disconnect between Teams and my headset. Just to add in as well to everything that Chris has said, I think the other The other lever that we're pulling more on is the aspect of benefits and joining the thinking with benefits and outcomes. So we're moving away from change management being a nice thing to do to being a real hard edge for the business, in terms of you don't get the benefits or you don't get all the benefits if you don't land the change properly. One of the we get lots of assumptions around benefits and the size and scale of benefits. One of the assumptions that's never in there is that the change may or may not land well. It's just a given that it will. So getting good change management in early doors and linking it to benefits, we're finding is a good way of getting leaders and people in the project community to recognise the value of change.
Cheers, Simon. I think that's a really good point. I want to pick up on so Sarah, I think, had asked about our working closely with HR, and absolutely, I think, has been the case all the way through. And again, in two key ways. So we work very closely with the HR business partners in terms of understanding the impacts of changes across the piece, and we definitely take their advice. We've also worked really closely with our own organisational education and development people who are based in our HR department, in terms of helping to focus, I guess, on the capability enhancements we need across the organisation. Let's see. Okay, and you using HRBP has been key on the ground too. Okay, I think Lisa's answered your other question. Oh, okay, and we've got another. You have a change management specific interest group within the healthcare project delivery community on Knowledge Hub, which is open to anyone on the NHS. Yeah, again, that's another group that we've spoken to and been a part of as a result of this. So that looks like that's it from a questions point of view. Again, and we will go through the chat and we'll have a look if there are any questions we've missed while I've been rabbiting onwards. I hope that's been a useful session for you. And again, we'll share those slides as we go forward. Thank you very much for your time, folks. I hope that's been useful.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.